Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you all here today. I'm Jim Olson, Assistant Executive Director for the National Tile Contractors Association. And again, I hope all of you and your families are healthy and safe. Today's webinar is titled Gauge Porcelain Tile and Continued Changes to Industry Standards. This is an overview of gauge porcelain tiles and gauge porcelain tile panel slabs, and what makes this product category so exciting for exteriors. Understand the importance of continued changes and the benefit of using an ANSI product and installation standards, as well as the TCNA Handbook for your project, specifications of gauge porcelain tiles and gauge porcelain tile panel slabs. Hear about the industry guidelines and standards development process, the frequency of revisions, and how that has changed recently. Our sponsor for this presentation is MAPEI. Please look for their advertisements in Tile Letter Magazine and multiple NTCA digital platforms. Before we continue, I have a little business as usual. Today's webinars will be muted. Please use the questions area on your computer to type in your questions. We will answer your questions at the end of this presentation. All of our webinars are available to watch at any time on the NTCA YouTube channel within 48 to 72 hours after the webinar is presented. Please go to the NTCA YouTube channel, subscribe, and you will be notified of all upcoming NTCA videos, including all technical webinars, giving you easier access to watch all current and past programs at your convenience. If the audio on your computer is poor, call the number provided on the invite to this webinar and listen on your phone. All right, here we go. Today's speaker, Jim Whitfield, FCSI, CCPR, LEED, LEED AP, is the Director of Technical Services at MAPEI. He manages a strong technical services department that provides support for MAPEI's many products for tile and stone installation systems, floor covering installation systems, and products for wood flooring. He is actively involved in the development of tile industry standards on TCNA, ANSI, and ISO committees. Jim is also an NTCA ambassador and a proud member of the NTCA Technical Committee. He is the current president of the MMSA, Materials, Methods, and Standards Association. In addition, the Construction Specification Institute honored Jim with fellowship in 2001, and I'm honored to have him here presenting this. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that very much. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Jim mentioned, I'm going to talk about gauge porcelain tile and the industry standards. There's been some great changes recently. I wrote an article for Tile Magazine earlier this last summer, talking about some of the changes that have occurred, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on that, including the passing of the exterior installation standard for gauge porcelain tile, which is huge news, and it's actually passed the ANSI committee and is now waiting for ANSI themselves to stamp it and should be in publication by the end of the year. So I think that's pretty exciting news with an interior standard already out there. We're also working on methods for the TCNA Handbook. So there's a lot of exciting new news with gauge porcelain tile. I'll get into a lot of the details as we go through this in much more detail. So let's talk about gauge porcelain tile and the industry standards. Learning objectives, Jim read through those, so I'm not going to bore you with this. But we'll do a big overview on gauge porcelain tile and gauge porcelain tile panels/slabs, why that name, the importance of industry standards, how that development process even occurs, and what do we really mean by consensus? How do we achieve consensus in order to pass a standard? All right, first let's talk about gauge porcelain tile, what it really means. These examples are great pictures of die cut, if you might, traditional porcelain tile. You see in the center picture that there's a die there that fills up with the compacted powder of feldspar, silica, etc., to make a porcelain tile, and it's compressed. You can see on the right, it coming out of a machine. It's compressed anywhere from 3,000 tons of force all the way up to 10,000 tons of force. So there's more traditional 12 by 12, 12 by 24 type manufacturing process. What we're talking about today with gauge porcelain tile is very, very different, and that's why I want to kind of, if you might, set the market for what that looks like. This right here on the left is a picture from TCNA's labs and the largest traditional porcelain tile manufactured today. So that's a 4 foot by 4 foot tile. On the right, you can see a installer installing a good size, looks like 12 by 24 to me. So these are fairly traditional sizes when it comes to manufacturing of porcelain tile today. But what we want to talk about is gauge porcelain tile. What is the difference? Gauge porcelain tile comes out onto a conveyor belt, and it is just a powder, nothing more than a powder or the materials used to manufacture porcelain tile. There's no restrictions on it. You don't see it die. You don't see it inhibited in any way. It's compressed between, in this case, large flat metal plates up to 15,000 tons of force. And there's another manufacturing process called continuum that uses round compression, but still same principle. It goes to a very large line like you see in the upper left-hand corner from Panaria. And when it comes out from the manufacturing kiln and production, it comes out in as thin as 3 millimeters thick, or about 1/8 of an inch, as you see in the upper right-hand corner. So exceptional change when it comes to the manufacturing process for ceramic tile, or porcelain tile in this case. Typical sizes, gauge porcelain tiles can be anywhere from 1 meter to 3 meters, or about 39 inches by 118 inches. As large as 5'3" by 10'5". I have heard of tiles as long as 17 feet. It's clearly my understanding, based on the fact that they're putting on a conveyor belt, they can produce about any size you want. The only problem would be maneuvering that around. We're going to talk today about gauge porcelain tile in the thinner gauges. I'm talking about 6.5 millimeters to about 3.5 millimeters. So about 1/8 of an inch to a little over 1/4 inch in thickness. There is also a whole nother market out there today because of this manufacturing process and no limitations to it. We can put out as thick as 30 millimeter or just a little over 1 inch in thickness porcelain tile as well. Why would you have something like that? And I'm going to talk about this briefly right now, but 30 millimeter thick porcelain tile, that's used in landscaping, literally laying it in your driveway, if you might, and they put grass and sod and so on around it. It's used for access systems, suspended floors, if you might, and pedestal systems. So without any kind of backing, they're pretty much have all their strength within themselves. I know there's a lot of manufacturers out there with other thicknesses like 12 millimeter and so on, where you could actually kind of route those, finish those just like a stone slab, and put that into place for a countertop as an example. But all right, why are we talking about gauge porcelain tile again? I know there's probably a presentation on gauge porcelain tile every other week, and there's a good reason for that. It's very, very innovative. It's very new. It's exciting. It's continuing to grow on a continuous basis. I think what's most important that I really want to stress here is that it's here to stay. I think, I've seen the manufacturing facilities in Italy and how they stack it and how they manufacture it and how they store it, how they cut it, etc. And in my opinion, one thing that's really unique here is, and I really want to talk about that stocking end of it, but let me come back to that in a second. One, we're not firing it up quite as long in a kiln. It's usually a kiln that's combined with gas as well as electric, not quite as long. It uses much less raw materials. Obviously, we're 1/8 of an inch instead of a traditional 3/8 of an inch or 10 millimeter porcelain tile. It's a heck of a lot less expensive to ship. We can get more on a pallet, we can get more on a truck, we can get more on a ship. It's a lot easier to cut and drill. And now let me talk a little bit more about the sizes, because I think that's very important. One, we have a tendency to focus on these large panels, 1 meter by 3 meter, or like I said, 5'6" by 10'5" or whatever it is. But there's a lot of other sizes cut out of that. So I've seen manufacturing of planks in thin tile or engaged porcelain tile, fiberglass backed. But I've seen planking, I've seen 20 by 20s or half meter by half meter. I've seen 1 meter by 1 meter, of course, and a variety of other sizes. And really, I want to stress that that's important to understand. In many cases, they're producing a large panel. They can pick that up on a pallet, if you might, put it into stock. And let's say that you need 12 by 24s or you need 18 by 36, whatever it is, pull those blanks off, if you might, and then send them back to the machine for cutting to the size that you need. So from an innovation standpoint, this manufacturing process is very, very good for the tile industry, using less materials, not firing quite as long, and being able to manufacture a variety of different sizes, and in most cases out of one large panel. So you can see this is going to be around for a while. I can't imagine why we would go back to, I mean, traditional tiles here as well, and it'll be here for some of the standardized sizing. Some of those same ones that I mentioned, 12 by 12, 12 by 24, 18 by 36, etc. Why? Because we've got a lot of machines to produce that. It makes sense. It's what we're used to. But in time, I think we're going to see this process expand quite a bit. So let me talk a little bit more about standards. Why do we want to have product standards? Yes, this picture on the left is not a product standard. It is not an ANSI standard to lean up against the wall with all your weight and see if it pulls off the mortar. But I highly suspect if they did that same person with the same method every single time, they'd get some pretty consistent results. And that's really what standards are all about. I need to have testing, if you might, that qualifies a product for a specific standard, and we'll use porcelain tile as an example. I need to have a testing standard that if I was to hire a new lab technician tomorrow, and after their orientation and they're comfortable with the types of materials that we're working with, I gave them a test standard and said, I need you to qualify this mortar as a 118.4. And they should be able to do it just as well as somebody that's been doing it for 5 years, maybe not as quite as quick, but certainly as with similar results. And I think that's very, very important, regardless of the manufacturing company or the mortar, regardless of the person doing the testing, regardless of the types of materials being used. They're all fairly consistent. The tools being used are consistent. We're trying to establish a quality level that can kind of show us, if you might, what all the different materials or different mortars, for instance, how they compare, so that you can make a good selection and get the mortar that you need specifically for your project. So we're trying to establish a quality level on products that have already been used and we know are successful in the United States. We want to build confidence in a new tile category. So that's really I'll talk a lot about that today with gauge porcelain tile. We did a lot of testing and installations and a variety of different things, which I'll show you today, which hopefully will help you understand how we build confidence in this product category. And to establish a reference standard. Architects, specifiers, building owners, they don't really want to call out products by proprietary needs if they don't have to. If they can say, I want a beige tile, it's got to be 1 meter by 3 meters. I'm looking for a thickness of 5 millimeters as an example. And anybody that can supply it, I want to get a good price from. Well, obviously that makes them far more competitive in the marketplace. And that's really what they're after, is a good quality product with quality levels established that they can put out there without having to be proprietary. Because let's face it, if I said I want MAPEI's porcelain tile versus I want any manufacturer that's within the standard, within the sizes that I mentioned earlier, 1 meter by 3 meters, 5 millimeters thick, in a beige color. Well, needless to say, when a variety of different manufacturers get involved, it's going to become quite a bit more competitive in the bidding process, in turn giving the owner a better quality product for less money. And that's really where the standards come in. From an architect standpoint or a specifier standpoint, they get to write a product into the standard, establishing a quality level that they're looking for, and still in a good generic form. So that's why we like product standards, and the design market itself does as well. Let's talk a little bit about consensus. So what happens here in the tile industry is we pass our standards, and I'm talking about ANSI, ISO, even TCNA Handbook methods by consensus. That means we get a large group of people in a room. As you see in this picture, that's about half of them. Typically, ANSI, as an example, I think has 64 people on it. And we present a standard that can be developed within ANSI, within the ANSI group, different people, or it could be developed by another committee entirely separate, like MMSA, Materials and Methods Standards Association, and brought to ANSI. But we try to agree on it. We try to get the opinion of everybody within that group. Now you can imagine you couldn't hardly order lunch for 64 people and get an agreement on what we're going to have for lunch, much less a technical document with testing tech methods and standardized languages and so on. It's very, very difficult to come to an agreement. However, what we do is we put together a decent, our best shot, if you might, at writing a standard, and I'll use the exterior one as an example in a little bit more detail. And then we submit it to the committee. We submit it to the committee and ask for their comments. There's a small committee that's helped us pass an interior as well as exterior installation standard for gauge porcelain tile. And in my opinion, the chair, Noah Chitty, has done an exceptionally good job of making sure that he gets comments back before the actual hard vote so that we can address negatives. So sends it out to a few people to get a feel for it, not to mention the committee previous to this, but then sends it out to a few other people, and usually a good consensus, if you might, of members. So you might have a tile consultant, you might have a tile manufacturer, setting material manufacturer, labor, whether it be the union or just members of NTCA, or for that matter, just anybody in labor. And try to get opinions from all those different groups so that when it comes to the vote, we've kind of tried to knock out all the negatives. And not to mention, as a committee, when writing the standard, it can become pretty easy to get tied up in what you think is right and not necessarily what is right as to the large group. So anyway, you put the standard out there, you address negatives, and that may require changes within the standard itself. It may require nothing more than explaining what is meant by a statement within the standard. Everybody comes to an agreement, and in turn, then we get a passing of the standard. That standard then goes on to ANSI for the rubber stamp, and of course, publication from that point on. In our case, our Secretariat of ANSI is TCNA, so they're the ones that publish it as well. I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a view of how we pass TCNA handbook methods as well as ANSI and ISO standards. But it's a large group. It's very difficult to come to an agreement, but not if you do it the proper way. One thing that we're working on right now that I hear come up quite often is the TCNA handbook. You know, how do we get methods for gauge porcelain tile in the TCNA handbook? I was part of a small committee that started the idea of adding methods to the TCNA handbook. And we took a few methods, I think we took 16, and just said, what would it look like if we took the current methods and just inserted GPT to it? Right now we have tile in there, we have glass in there, glass tiles. Stone is its own section, so we really don't have to address that as much. But glass has its own particular notes within many of the TCNA methods that people don't necessarily recognize, but they're certainly in there. And GPT would typically have the same thing. After working on 16 different methods, floors and walls, and really taking a good look at it, we decided that it probably is best to just have its own section, like the stone section, for gauge porcelain tile. So then drop the idea of inserting it into 16 current methods of the TCNA Handbook and tried to create 16 methods specific to gauge porcelain tile. That process has been going on probably for 2-3 years, and we're actually moving along pretty steady now. I think we came to an agreement as a group of the important changes that have to occur in order for GPT methods to end up in the TCNA Handbook. And now we're trying to adapt those to the 16 methods that we'd originally proposed and eventually take that to all the methods within the handbook if they pertain. There probably are going to be some methods that we don't feel is appropriate for gauge porcelain tile and just won't be added. We don't, at this time, I'm not aware of anybody recommending putting gauge porcelain tile direct on a wood substrate as an example. So we wouldn't have a plywood substrate. We have cement board over that in TCNA installation methods, installation standard as well for gauge porcelain tile. So that might be a good example. But eventually we would like to see a handbook for TCNA gauge porcelain tile methods. And that is in the works. It's going to take some time, but it is definitely in the works. The basic principles of what that method may look like are totally agreed upon at this time. So this is an example of trying to sit down and sharing examples with labor, with different manufacturers, different consultants. And we take the F113 in this case method, and as you can see, we are making it a GPT or gauge porcelain tile panels / slabs method, not trying to make it a tile, glass tile, and gauge porcelain tile method. So some of the things we have to do is, of course, remove language that doesn't pertain, right? Like glass tile. Sorry, I'm trying to get a little pointer here. All right, so you can see here we're removing glass tile. We're removing all these in blue, inserting some additional language, as you can see here. I'm not asking you to read this, trust me. It's not intended to be read at this size. But again, removing ceramic tile and glass tile from the method itself, making sure it's gauge porcelain tile, porcelain tile panel / slabs, correcting the CAD detail. So there's a lot that goes into this, and this is probably, I don't know off the top of my head, I'm going to say a 4-page method right there for the gauge TCNA handbook. So it takes a lot of editing to go through and try and correct a method. This is consensus. It truly is. These examples were shared with labor, and as I said, the other groups, representatives from the NTCA submitted additional changes, and then at Surfaces a year ago with TCNA executive director, staff, NTCA, and proposers, we finally started to make some major progress. And that's an example of consensus. It takes a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of agreement. And then once we come to this agreement on just a few methods, that has to be implemented into all the other methods that are in the handbook. So it's a big chore, but one that'll be good for our industry in years to come. Let me talk a little bit about the ANSI standards for gauge porcelain tile and gauge porcelain tile panels / slabs. So there are 3 standards today for gauge porcelain tile. ANSI 137.3, which is the tile standard itself. As I said, 3.5 millimeter to 6.5 millimeter in thickness, what those manufacturing requirements are and so on. There is an installation standard for thin set of gauge porcelain tile and gauge porcelain tile panels / slabs, 118.9 for interiors. There is a new ANSI A10820 exterior installation standard for thin set mortar for gauge porcelain tile. As I mentioned, this has just been a recent agreement, recently passed, I should say. Very few people are aware of that. It is now waiting for the ANSI rubber stamp, and then it'll go into publication. I would expect to see it before the end of the year. If you're familiar with this book on the right, this is how we put out the ANSI standard earlier this year for the product and installation standard. So I would expect the exterior one to go into that. Ideally, when we come up with TCNA methods for it, it's feasible that those methods may go into the same type of single book and have them all published for just gauge porcelain tile. I'm not sure of that for a fact, but it should occur. If you're wondering how to get these TCNA publications, look up www.tcnatile.com and products and services publications. You can order them right there, digital copies and or hard copies. All right, so in order to establish some standards, there was a group of, I'll say 13 people off the top of my head that met in the middle of the country and did a lot of different installations, walls, floors, from concrete to self-leveler to frame construction in order to achieve the new ANSI standards. We tried every type of trowel that you could possibly think of. We tried it on one tile only and not on the substrate. We used it on the substrate and not on the tile. We used it on the substrate and the tile. Just a lot of testing, extensive testing over a good day and a half. And then came back later and destroyed it all to get a good idea of how successful we were. So what you see on the left here is a variety of different trowel sizes. Probably best example that we really kind of all agreed on was the Euro and the Euro. In other words, using a Euro notch trowel on both the tile and the substrate, we end up with a good bedding coat of 3/16 of an inch for gauge porcelain tile. And we felt that was a minimum thickness required for gauge porcelain tile and to get the type of coverage that we were trying to achieve. So again, we did it in this case with frame construction and a gypsum panel. We did it with frame construction and cement board. And again, it was very successful, very consistent. We found successfully that we could get 3/16 with the Euro and the Euro. So these are important things that in trying to establish a standard that we end up with consistency. Again, 3/16 Euro, Euro, 3/16 Euro, Euro, and 3/16. That is not the only trowel, by the way. There are a variety of other ones that are recommended. In this case, you see a 3mm slant ridge Ramondi type trowel. In addition to using different types of trowels, we use different types of methods for embedding the tile into it. Tapping it with a grout float, tapping it with Ramondi type paddle, and using a 2x4, a variety of different things. I do not in any way recommend a 2x4, by the way. Next day, came back and peeled all those off in order to check the coverage and see how much of a bond we got. And we, again, using different methods. In some areas, we vibrated the outside edges, and sometimes we didn't, to see if we really established that much better coverage by using a vibrated orbital sander around the outside edge of that tile. Again, just trying to simulate some different walls and applications or installation methods. Took a very, very good look at measuring coverage. How would we do that? With a large panel, it's too much of an area to try to even begin to evaluate coverage. So we really kind of broke it down to 1 foot by 1 foot areas, and then took measurements within each one of these 1 foot by 1 foot areas. How much we had coverage. This is coverage of contact to the tile. This is showing ribs. All those ribs are making contact, but these are voids. Really, we got very good coverage with this example, but then took those figures for the length and the width of the void, the square inches of it compared to the size of the tile, and came up with a method of measuring coverage in every single installation. So we averaged, in this case, 96% coverage in the very worst square foot. So including the perimeter and all the areas around the tile, we end up with 96 square feet. So then we took a look at what it looked like when we first lifted up the tile for coverage, which looks pretty decent here, and what it looked like the next day. And we found that when it was wet, it really didn't represent coverage very well. It just represented the peaks and valleys of tearing the mortar apart. And it looked like it had great coverage, but it truly didn't. When you come back the next day, obviously you don't get peaks and valleys from pulling the mortar apart. You just get where you're in contact and when you're not. That's what you're seeing here. So in this case, we were using a Ramondi flow ridge or slant ridge, 8mm and 8mm, both on the tile and the substrate. And we only tapped it in with the grout float. The one on the left, we used a vibrating sander throughout the tile, and you can see how much higher the coverage is. These mortars are typically thixotropic, which means they flow under shear. A good example of flowing or thixotropic that you might be familiar with is a bottle of ketchup. You pick up a bottle of ketchup, pick it upside down, and nothing comes out. You shake it and create shear, and it starts to flow. You stick a knife in it, create some shear, it starts to flow. Same thing is true of these mortars, these quality mortars that we're using in gauge porcelain tile today, and many of the quality mortars out there. They're what we call thixotropic. So we place the tile, we give it a little bit of vibration, the mortar becomes more fluid, increasing our coverage at the same time, still holding our tile up. So the ridges, if you might, don't collapse to the point that they flow up in between the tile, but they actually just become more in contact with the tile. And this is, again, some of the examples of coverage that we achieved with two different methods of embedding it. Here's Euro notch and Euro notch with a 1 meter by 3 meter. The largest void was a 1/2 inch. And largest void at the perimeter was a 1/2 inch. So these helped us come up with our coverage requirements for the interior standard for gauge porcelain tile. And again, similar method, 93%. On a block wall, 92%. Again, when completely measured foot by foot, all the way through the tile. Euro by euro, euro and euro again, 90%. We consistently ended up above 90% coverage. I'll come back to that because that's important when we talk about the coverage requirements for installation standard. So let's talk a little bit about the product standard. While we were doing the installation standard testing, the TCNA technical committee was meeting as well to establish a product standard. And a product standard that, one, first identified what it is. Those of you that have been around a while, you know what we used to call this. We called it thin tile. Everything was thin tile. The technical committee felt very strongly that that was okay, but not adequate to describe the product because we know that it could be manufactured at a variety of different thicknesses with this type of method of just putting powder, if you might, on a conveyor belt. So they decided that it's best to use the term gauged. Gauged like you would use gauged wire, gauged barbed wire, anything like that. So it could be called out in a variety of different gauges and thicknesses. Gauge porcelain tile is considered a tile that is less than 1 square meter. Gauge porcelain tiles. Gauge porcelain tile panels or gauge porcelain tile slabs are for 1 meter or larger. Now let's talk a little bit more about consensus because I think this is a great example of it. The technical committee did not easily agree on whether it should be gauge porcelain tile panels or what some people preferred, which was gauge porcelain tile slabs. So consensus came up with gauge porcelain tile panels / slabs. I know it sounds kind of funny as I say it as we're going through here, but I thought I'd try to give you an example of not only consensus, but really where that term comes from and what that really means. So it's really just an agreement in order to move the standard along. This standard involves a lot of different types of testing. It involves the thickness. In the case of 3.5 to, as I said, up to 5 millimeter for walls, or 5 millimeter to 6.5 for floors. It requires, in some cases, manufacturers put mesh on the back, usually a good solid polyurethane type adhesive to hold that there, or in some cases, they might even use an epoxy. It is submerged for bond strength testing with the mesh. The mesh is also removed so we can do absorption testing just like any other porcelain tile. We want to have a 0.5% absorption. So there's a variety of different testing that occurs on the product itself. This testing I want to talk about is really kind of unique. I don't know if you're familiar with the Robinson floor testing. It is considered a tile testing machine. The traditional one looks like you see in the upper right-hand corner here, where we add weights to 3 points on the pivot, if you might. These wheels are changed out from soft to hard rubber to steel. Let me give you an example of how Robinson test is typically used. I can take and create a concrete slab, which is inside this wooden box, 4-inch concrete slab. And then I thin set tile to it. In this case, it is a 2 foot by 2 foot porcelain tile, 3 millimeters thick. It is thin set direct to the concrete slab and then put under, these are the same types of 3 wheels that you see on the machine on the right, with weights being added on the center. In the bottom picture, what you see is actually gauge porcelain tile being tested on a joist, so it has the ability to deflect on a wood substrate in order to get a feel for what the floor might really do. I will tell you that this safety equipment is removed. That should not be there. We definitely want to make sure we have the cage and all that for safety reasons, but in this case, it's for photos only. A great example of how we use the Robinson test is, let's just take this one in the upper left-hand corner. So I've got a concrete slab 4 inches thick. I put thin set mortar underneath it, a traditional 3/8 of an inch or 10 millimeter porcelain tile on top of that, and I put it under a variety of different weights and move it around. What do I mean by a variety of different weights? The way the loading schedule is for this ANSI ASTM C627 testing is, it starts off with a soft rubber wheel, as I mentioned, looks similar to this. It'll go with 100 pounds per wheel. So they put 100 pounds on each one of these points, or each one of these points, and they rotate it around 900 times. Then it goes to 200 pounds with that soft rubber wheel, rotated 900 times. Then it goes to 300 pounds, soft rubber wheel, 900 times twice, or 1,800 times together. So you can see that it takes quite a bit for that to hold up. Then we go to a hard rubber wheel, again 100 pounds per wheel, 900 times, 200 pounds per wheel, 900 times, 300 pounds, 1,800 times. What we're looking for is any damage to the tile. Could be grout joint breaking out, could be flaking of the tile, could be a cracking of the tile, and at that point the testing stops. Then you go to a steel wheel, very, very demanding. Starts out at 50 pounds per wheel, goes 450 rotations. Then 100 pounds, then 150, all 450 rotations. 200, 250, and then 300 pounds per wheel, 450 rotations. That is what we call 14 cycles. And if it completes it, it's got a commercial rating. So it's very demanding test on the tile installation. Now, let me give you a great example. This method that I talked about up here with traditional tile, thin set, and concrete, it might go 14 cycles, right? Extra heavy. Wouldn't surprise me a bit. Matter of fact, I know for a fact that it can. But if I took a 10 millimeter or 3/8 of an inch thick recycled rubber sound membrane and thin set that to the concrete slab and then thin set my tile to the top of the membrane, would that same rotation make it? No. And that's exactly what the Robinson test is intended for, is to test a tile assembly and different things that we add to it in order to make sure that it holds up still, or that we have a feel for how it's going to perform on a job site. If I put a uncoupling membrane in there, sound reduction membrane in there, if I change the type of adhesive from thin set to, let's say, a urethane adhesive, how's that going to hold up? Those are all important things when it comes to testing floor assemblies, and that's what we do with the Robinson test. The reason why I bring this up is because the Robinson test is actually used for gauge porcelain tile. One of the things I think people were concerned with when gauge porcelain tiles first started coming over here, we've got this thin tile that's 1/8 of an inch. It's 1/3 the thickness of a traditional porcelain we're used to. Is it going to hold up? Is it really truly suitable for a floor? And this is how we started testing it, was with the Robinson. And then what if I put a rubber membrane underneath it for crack isolation or sound, or for that matter, waterproof membrane? Is it still going to hold up as well? So there's a lot of questions that came about years ago. It didn't feel like very long ago. If I'm talking 5 years ago, most of this testing was occurring. So really not that long ago. And all of these things were performed through the Robinson testing, and then we had comparative data. Because the weights are the same, the wheels are the same, everything is exactly the same. The assembly, for the most part, is typically concrete, 4-inch concrete slab. So really, it's almost always about the same. The only thing that changed was the components, or in this case, this tile versus a traditional 3/8 of an inch tile. So it really submits it to some demanding testing. In the TCNA Handbook, you'll find a service rating. In other words, saying how tile or an assembly might be able to be used from residential to light to moderate to heavy to extra heavy. And it's based on the cycles of the Robinson. 1 through 3 is residential. 1 through 6, and you have to pass all 6, is considered light commercial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the case of gauge porcelain tile, it is required to have a light commercial rating for a floor. I hope that makes sense. This is actually part of the product standard. Uncommon for tile standards, but matter of fact, first time it's been used in a tile standard. This is the type of breakage that we typically see with gauge porcelain tile, where it actually almost spalls if you mite the edge. Additional tests are minimum breaking strengths and modulus of rupture, and the requirements for 6,000 PSI or 175 pounds per foot. Let's talk about the installation standards and the new ANSI A10820 exterior installation standard. In the case of the exterior standard, there are 19 sections. The interior standard has 20. I think you'll notice some odd standards here, some things you typically wouldn't see in traditional tile standards, and that would be, how do you handle the material? How do you even order the material? There's requirements in here for qualified labor, general requirements for the installation. How do you embed the tile? What's the required coverage, because it is different than traditional tile? And workmanship, lippage, and grout joint size. So those are all things you might not commonly see in other tile installation standards. What types of substrates are suitable? Well, certainly a mortar bed, or in this case, exterior wall, a plaster or cementitious base coat, if you might, scratch and brown. Cement backer units, so putting up cement board, concrete, poured concrete, or CMU, all suitable for exterior cladding. Existing surfaces or substrates. The standard actually says that determining the soundness or suitability of the existing substrate shall be the responsibility of the building owner, design professional, or general contractor. It is not the requirement of the tile contractor. They're the ones that are asking to have tile added to the exterior. They should be responsible to say that the building is suitable. We're not engineers. In section 3, in related work specified, it actually says that when work for the tile contractor is specified in related work, it must indicate that within the product tile section product specification. So for instance, very, very common, you're going to find caulking or sealants in the required for the tile, but not in the tile section. It'll be in division 7. So in related sections, it should be listed to show the sealant material. In the case of exteriors, you've got all kinds of things that we have to address that we don't have interiors, like door frames. Sub-blocking, of course, is common to both, but flashing, how do you deal with a sill flashing in a window or a door? How about a header flashing? How do you tie into those? That's essential to making an exterior installation for tile successful. You must know how to flash a window and or door opening properly, period. No doubt about it. Substrate flatness, it's critical exterior too. It's critical on walls as well as floors, certainly. I know for many, many years, we were pushing and pushing hard for the tile industry to recognize that you can't just install tile without doing proper surface prep. It's expected for the vinyl and wood industry, but not expected for the tile industry. Many times a contractor might say, just put more mortar underneath it. Well, we need to have walls that are plumb and flat. The requirements are the exact same requirements they are for all tile, and that's for tiles with one edge 15 inches or longer. The maximum allowable deflection, I'm sorry, the maximum allowable variation is 1/8 of an inch in 10 feet or no more than 1/16 of an inch in 24 inches with a straight edge from the highest point in the floor. This is no different than current industry standards require. It's no different than the current industry standards require, but they are repeated within the standard because we felt it was important. So all surface preparation and remediation are not part of the installer's contract or scope of work. This is under general substrate requirements. So you're going to see a lot of contractor-friendly language in here. In other words, in order to bid a project, you should be able to just bid the proper installation of the tile, not necessarily if the substrate is going to meet the standard or not. We're going to assume it's going to meet the standard, and if it isn't, the GC or the contractor is going to be responsible for either one, getting it correct, or two, allowing for an alternative bid to make sure that the substrate prep is correct. I know that's uncommon, but really the committee felt it was a very, very important note when it comes to gauge porcelain tile exterior. And the informative note within the general substrate requirements says the owner should communicate in writing to the project design professional and general contractor the areas intended for tile installation in order to enable the project design professional or general contractor to make necessary allowances for the expected load, including weight of the tile and the setting bed. So from a structural standpoint, tile contractor can't be responsible for that. That's not his responsibility to be a structural engineer. His responsibility is to set tile. It is the design professionals and general contractor's responsibility, and the standard clearly calls that out. In section 6, job site requirements, the installation must have adequate and designated room to work. This is important with gauge porcelain tile. They're so big. Protection during and after is the general contractor's responsibility, and it should be protected from sunlight, rain, freezing, weather, etc. One really important note for an exterior installation is that the roofing system, flashings, and metal caps must be installed as soon as possible or soon as practical and to ensure a proper installation. One of the worst things that can happen is you can have a building, cement board or that matter CMU tile installed on it, and they never put a cap on the top of the roof, and water just pours between the tile and the substrate. You will have some colorful grout for a long, long time, no matter what you do. Material handling requirements, these tiles are different. They're very, very large. In case of fork trucks, it requires an extended fork of at least 84 inches. In the case of picking these tiles up, it requires a suction cup frame that you can actually carry the material. We call it a spine, if you might, to the tile. These tiles are flexible, so they can actually bend around an area. But in this case, we're trying to add some strength to it so that we actually have the ability to pick it up and maneuver it. Also takes some pre-planning on how to move these large pieces through a building. If you're having to move it up to the top of a building, you're not going to take it up through elevator, or for that matter, even a job site elevator. You need to typically have it sky lifted up. Section 9 requires installation contractor qualified installer. You either have to pass an ACT advanced certification for gauge porcelain tile test, NTCA training. They're doing these regional trainings going around the United States. Many manufacturers like ourselves, the setting materials, and even tile manufacturers are doing training programs like you see in the lower right-hand corner. NTCA famous trainer Gerald Sloan, now working for MAPEI, is doing an installation of plexiglass just to show how to get coverage. So any other program that might be approved by a specifier is also allowable. General requirements for the installation: don't install over unsatisfactory surfaces. The design professional should consult with the tile membrane and setting material manufacturer for adequate system. And tiles meet in 118A, 137.A. Make sure that they're suitable for the area or installation that they're being used for. Some may not be recommended exterior. I'm not aware of any like that, but it may be possible. The application of the mortar, you can see it takes a little bit different trowel. First thing we want to do to the substrate is make sure it's SSD'd or surface saturated dry. So we wet it down appropriately without leaving any pooling. And then use our special trowels. This happens to be a Euro trowel you see there. This is a Ramondi slant ridge, I'll say 8 millimeter, I think. So special trowels that really lend themselves to ridge claps. We notch out with the trowel, then we put the tile into it and try to get those notches to collapse or increase our coverage. Key the mortar in with the flat side of the trowel like normal, and then gauge it out with the notch size. Very, very consistently, so we don't have to do a lot with the edges, and they just fit nice and flat. Some other things on the embedment of the tile is using a suction cup frame to place it, like we showed earlier. Then you want to embed it with a weighted paddle. And a high-speed orbital sander will help around the outside edges, really through the body of the tile, but what's really required around edge to edge, making sure that you're getting a minimal lippage and increasing the coverage of that mortar right there at the outside edge as much as possible. Lippage control devices are suggested, strongly suggested, for any tiles larger than 1 meter by 1 meter. And really, with these types of lippage things, you want to take the caps off, clean them out, make sure they're nice and clean before you leave that job. Really do it as quick as possible so you can minimize your cleanup later. You can imagine the tile on an exterior wall. You really wouldn't want to be taking a screwdriver into the grout joint and digging it out, maybe slipping and chipping a 1 meter by 3 meter tile. Kind of expensive and very, very, very frustrating. So really clean it up while it's still fresh. The mortar requirements are 80% minimum requirements of 1 square foot. Remember, we kind of break it out into square foot sections. No voids exceeding 2 square inches around the outside edge. And coverage sufficiently distributed to support edges and corners. So that's really where we get a lot of the coverage, and we're really pushing to get good mortar consistency is around the outside edges and corners, but no less than 80% throughout the tile itself. Remember when I showed you all the testing we did interior, we showed a lot of pictures with 90, 95, 93% coverage, 98 even. That's where the 80% came from. Consistently, we were able to get 90% coverage, so we reduced it a little bit and said within the standard, this is adequate. Allowable lippage is the exact same as what it is for any other porcelain tile, 1/32, no different, even for these large tiles. These tiles can also be offset 50%. So you can line up the tile above it, 50% of this. Traditional tile, we have to do 30%, 33%. But in the case of gauge porcelain tile, they are so flat that we can actually do a 50% offset as well. One thing that's kind of recommended in the exterior standard is that in case instead of grout joints, you might consider movement joints on tiles that are larger than 1 meter by 1 meter. I know some manufacturers require this for exteriors, so make sure that you pay attention to what the requirements are for filling the void or the grout joint and or sealant in outside installations. Workmanship, again, allowable lippage is 1/32, same as traditional porcelain tile. Grout joints can be 3 times the variation in the size of the tile. This is fairly uncommon in gauge porcelain tile as well, that they're out of square. But if it is a 1/16 of an inch out of square, you're going to have the opportunity to move it 1/16 of an inch more. 3 times that, or 3/16 inch grout joint. It can be set with a 50% offset, as I just mentioned. Movement joints. Movement joints, yes, they're essential, including with gauge porcelain tile. As I said, on exteriors, a lot of times you'll see manufacturers recommend that the whole thing be sealant joints and not, or movement joints and no grout, but follow the manufacturer's recommendations for that. These tiles expand and contract just like any other porcelain tile. This picture that you see on the right is actually one picture for perimeter movement joints around the inside corners as well as outside corners. And in the case of exterior installation, it should be every 8 to 12 feet, a movement joint. Now, when you've got panels that are the smallest ones, typically 10 foot, you can see why we're putting movement joints throughout each panel. Protection of the tile work. When completed and cleaning is completed, it's the obligation of the tile installer is requirements cease, and it becomes a requirement to protect it above the general contractor. To avoid damage to the finished tile installation, scheduled installations of exterior work like building enclosure, interior work in close proximity, and abutment to exterior structure that may affect the exterior tile should be completed previous to the installation of the tile. Maintenance. All projects require some maintenance. In the case of exteriors, a lot of it would be sealant, but it's the owner's responsibility to do routine inspections, appropriate maintenance, and to ensure that all cleaning methods and products are approved by the grout setting material mortar manufacturer. Final finishes should be maintained to protect the tile as well as the substrate and supporting structure. Movement joints, transitions between different finishes, openings and penetrations require specific attention and periodic maintenance. Again, movement joints or sealant joints really require paying attention to them. Make sure they remain sealed so we're not getting a lot of water pouring in there, especially a change of plane, flashings, and so on. All right, I need to wrap this up. Carefully review the product and installation standards, interior as well as exterior. Follow the manufacturer of the tile and setting material for exterior recommendations. Really pay attention to that because they do change. Make sure the type of installation is approved for its intended use, whether it's wall, floor, interior, exterior, or for that matter, even the service rating. As an example, the interior standard requires that no steel wheels be used on it. The gauge porcelain tile should not be subject to interior steel wheel dolly traffic, as an example. Gauge porcelain tile and very large format tiles are an incredible opportunity for qualified installers. Consider getting trained if you haven't. Work with a setting material, tool, or tile manufacturer to establish a good training program and help on specific applications. Don't hesitate to call us. Don't hesitate to call us as a manufacturer of setting materials, or for that matter, the tile manufacturer. We've all got technical departments. I've got a very large group here and more than willing to help you with gauge porcelain tile questions, and for that matter, any of your questions, but don't hesitate to call us. Our 800 number is all over our literature, our packaging. It's readily available. Our website for that matter. So practice. Get used to what it feels like. Who's going to pick it up? What's going to take to get wrapped up around an elevator as an example, or a window. Kind of move those tiles as a group before you start notching everything up and troweling it in. It always helps to do a quick dry run. And really strongly suggest the contractors that work for you, or for that matter that you're asking for their work to be done, that they either have training through a qualified tile or setting material manufacturer, NTCA regional trainings, or ACT certification. We do them here. We support the NTCA regional trainings as well as IMI's trainings, the union, and the ACT certification itself. So we're glad to help. And ask questions. If you're not sure, ask questions. Ask questions of manufacturers, ask questions of fellow contractors, the good fellow contractors. With that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it back over to Jim. I want to thank you. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Jim, what a great job of outlining and reviewing this new standard. Fantastic. And please do ask questions. Everybody should ask questions. We're all here to help each other. Call the NTCA, email the NTCA, MAPEI. any manufacturer you work with. They're all here for that reason. So that's fantastic. Hey, Jim, we got a couple questions here. You got a minute?
Sure.
All right, great. So the first question is, for commercial use, what type of gauge steel studs should be used in walls that are to receive large panel gauge tile, along with wall deflection? That is, what is the wall deflection? What is the required wall deflection, I guess is what he's asking.
The deflection rating that the TCNA has established was L/360. And how you achieve that with studs and so on, I could not answer that. I'm not a structural engineer. I'm a tile installer is my background. I can tell you that, you know, there is maybe a concern out there, or should be, for what we call EQ studs, equivalent studs, you know, a 20 gauge stud that's actually maybe much thinner than that. Typically those require bridging or drywall on both sides in order to have the adequate strength. So if you had an EQ stud, let's say around an elevator for that matter, and there was no backing to it, you're going to have a lot of deflection, and that should be a major concern. So I apologize, I can't answer the questions about the thickness of the stud and so on, because again, I'm not a structural engineer.
That was a very loaded question I sent you right there, but I would just say the same thing. Please talk to your structural engineer for that job, and make sure that they're comfortable for us tile installers to install that product in that area for sure. So, all right, great. Next question is, let's see here. Are there any current limitations on the height that these panels can be installed under in an exterior application?
Currently, there are no requirements for, no changes in the requirements for the height of the installation of gauge porcelain tile. There are requirements for the size. Currently, the code says it's no more than, I believe, 3 total square feet and no edge greater than 2 foot. That's been changed in 2021. The code will come out with some larger sizes. It's basically about 1 meter by 2 meters. But the height of it, the ICC or commercial code, it does not currently have any requirements for tile at any height. It's not uncommon in Europe that above 2 stories, they require some sort of mechanical fastener as well. But we do not do that here in the United States, at least by the code itself. I will tell you, as a manufacturer, I may ask for something different once you start getting too high with too heavy, or in areas where I think it's too risky. So, you know, that's why, again, you want to work with your manufacturer. We may come back and say, yeah, I'm not so comfortable with that, hanging upside down in a ceiling area, you know, 2 stories above people walking in that store, unless you can be assured that you're going to get your 80% coverage and so on. So we may have some requirements that change it, but there are no code requirements at this time.
Great. All right. Let's see here. If a porcelain slab cracks and no one is around, never mind.
Well, thanks, Jim.
Mesh back porcelain requires epoxy bonding.
If you're backing, if you have a mesh backing and it has a epoxy coating that's holding that backing in there, it would typically require an epoxy or a similar type of resin adhesive. So it's not common, but it could.
So are you saying that regardless to the type of mortar or adhesive, we need to always trowel both the substrate and the tile?
In the case of thin set cementitious modified thin set mortar, the only thing that I recommend, that I addressed in this standard does not address adhesives, only thin set methods. It requires both the substrate and the tile, yes.
Okay. Well, it looks like that is all of my questions today. I just think you did a great job, Jim. You really let everyone know what this new standard is and gave them information on how to continue to move forward and do a great job. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you very much. And again, continue to pay attention. There's a lot more changes coming, I assure you. I mean, maybe some of these questions that we got today are based on some of those future changes, like using adhesive instead of a thin set, you know, or for that matter, you know, maybe above grade at a certain level, we are going to have mechanical fastener. But at this time, this is where we're at. And look for the next major change I hope to see is the TCNA method. So thank you guys very much.
Hey, real quick, I have a question here that just came in. And I'm not sure I know what this is, but sintered material falls in this category.
I'm not sure I understand it either, Jim.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I know what sintered material is. SINTERED. Sintered qualifies, someone just said.
Good.
Sintered versus porcelain. I don't even know what all that is, so.
Oh, I'm okay. Well, I'm not.
Oh, neolith.
I have an idea what that is, and it might be more of a synthetic type or material, not necessarily just a porcelain, but more of a. And I apologize for the name, but more of a decked-in type product or something similar to that, where it's more of a compressed composite material.
Right. And so, does that isn't in this standard, or is it?
This is based on gauge porcelain tile, period. They may choose to use this method or recommend this method for the installation of it, but really it isn't written towards that product, no.
Yeah, okay.
I know a lot of the installation methods are similar though, but again, that's not what we were shooting for in the standard.
Great. All right, everybody, thank you. Please look forward to our next webinar. We'll have a couple webinars coming up in the month of October. Please look forward to Total Solutions Plus is going to be virtual this year. So pay attention to your emails and your invites, and we look forward to the next meeting. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye now.